Okay, so we left off then in 1909 with the two coming back from Clark University. And then as soon as Jung comes back, he says the dream that he had about the levels on the house immediately rekindled his interest in archaeology. He said that before he had been interested in going into medicine, he had thought that he might become an archaeologist. So he said, I went to go visit an archaeology site, and then I started reading volumes of mythology and history because I wanted to become familiar with, the dream seemed to be telling me that I needed to become familiar with these historical epochs. So he dives into mythology, and he's reading all these obscure 19th century anthropologists and mythologists, and he's writing Freud these letters saying, by the way, now I'm into mythology, and I'm just finding it to be an incredible revelation. And occasionally he'll lapse into this, what Freud calls theological language, and he'll start talking about God and Satan, all these different types of things that make Freud very uncomfortable. And Freud will write back and say, well, don't stay too long there in the tropics, you need to come back to science. But at this time, other individuals other psychoanalysts were beginning to write about mythology. Right in 1909, or was it 1910, Otto Rank writes The Myth of the Birth of the Hero. And Carl Abraham had written a book called Dreams and Myths. So it was becoming, almost everyone was becoming interested in it, but Freud at the time. And so Jung begins writing part one of the book that is really his first masterpiece and demarcates the point where he and Freud part ways. And part one, not so much, but more so part two. And this is, the German is Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido. Transformations and symbols of the libido. Mm-hmm. And it is precisely his reformulation of the libido theory that marks their departure, because as far as Freud is concerned, libido is sexual energy, and it is what drives us, and it is behind everything we do. But Jung says, well, I think it's more complicated than that. I think libido represents psychic energy generally, which can assume different instincts. For example, the instinct toward self-assertion can very often, the martial aspect is very different from the Venusian aspect and so forth. And so he begins talking about, and not only that, but one of the primary heretics was Alfred Adler, and Adler had begun to build a psychology based on the will to power, picking up the clue from Nietzsche. And in 1911, he drops out of the movement entirely because he cannot agree with Freud's theory. So Jung publishes the first part of this, and as you're reading along in the letters, you know the denouement has come when Jung's wife writes a letter to Freud. And she says, I'm just concerned because I know Carl is very much interested in your opinion of his new work, and you haven't said a word about it. And don't tell him that I'm writing to you, but would you please at least mention something to him about it? And in fact, Freud had actually come through and briefly visited them for a couple of days and didn't say a word about it. And so Freud then takes the trouble to write a letter to Jung, and he says in like the third or fourth paragraph, oh, by the way, I've read your Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, and it's fantastic. It's the best thing you've done so far. It could be a little clearer on certain points. And I should backtrack just a little bit and say that Jung had sent him an earlier version of the manuscript, which was an extract of a lecture that he had given that later became the core material. And they had disputed over the symbolism associated with the slaying of the bull in Mithraism. And that becomes a major player here as we move along. So other than those criticisms regarding his interpretation of the slaying of the bull in Mithraism, Freud says, it's a very good book, and I really enjoyed it. Oh, by the way, I've decided to begin moving into the sphere of religion, and now I'm writing a work on the subject too. And but don't worry, we won't collide because my book will go deeper than yours. And
they're both so German.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true.
And so Jung takes it in stride. He writes back a polite letter and so forth. He tries not to take offense. And but the letters get more and more strained as time goes on. And finally, there comes another episode which Jung later refers to as Freud's Kreuzlingen gesture. Now, apparently, Kreuzlingen is on the opposite side of the Lake Constance from where Jung is living. He has built himself the famous tower at Bollingen. Not the tower yet, but he's bought the property and he's building the house. This is Mars sextile Saturn, the builder. And Freud has dropped just a short line saying, oh, by the way, I have to go visit Binswanger in Kreuzlingen, and I don't have time to do anything else. He's very cryptic about it, and Jung's wondering, well, does that mean he's going to stop by my place, or what? So Freud never does, and Jung writes back a very heated letter saying, oh, your Kreuzlingen gesture is beginning to become very transparent to me now because you haven't said anything about my book, so I imagine it means it's symbolic that you don't think much of my book. And this was before the Emma had written, Jung's wife had written a letter. So anyway, the tensions are becoming very strained, and finally there comes the Psychoanalytic Congress in Munich in 1912, and they're beginning to iron things out, but not entirely. Freud and Jung take a walk there, and they go back and forth about the Kreuzlingen thing. Freud saying, well, I thought you were just going to come up and see me at Binswanger's. Binswanger was sick, and he was one of the psychoanalysts. I thought you were just going to come up and see me, and so they go back and forth, and they kind of smooth things out, iron out their differences. Then they go back in, and they go into the lunchroom, and everybody's eating, and then somebody brings up the subject of the Pharaoh Akhenaten.
The what?
The Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called founder of the Atun cult, with the sun and the rays ending in little hands. And Freud will later say in Moses and Monotheism that Akhenaten may have been the founder of monotheism because of his centralization upon the sun. And but at this time, somebody brings up the subject and says, well, Akhenaten actually was trying to murder his father in the sense that he would go through all the old Egyptian monuments and erase his father's name and write his own name on it. And Jung, for some reason, took offense at this, and he said, well, I don't think that's the case at all, because every pharaoh did that. Every pharaoh was the new incarnation of the same God and felt that they had the right to do that. It had nothing to do with his animosity toward his father. Jung faints for the second time. Or Freud faints, I'm sorry. Freud faints. And then Jung rushes in and picks him up. Jung was a big, strong man, and he got bigger and bigger as time went by, and Freud got smaller. And he picks him up, and he said, when Freud woke up, he looked at me as though I were his father. And I felt at that moment that I understood him and felt compassion for him. So they go back, and they've patched everything up, and each retreats to, one goes back to Zurich, Freud goes back to Germany, or Vienna rather. And it takes about one exchange of letters for it to fall back apart again, because Freud says, well, it was just a little neurosis, it's just something that I have to clean up, and you should attend to your neuroses too, type of thing. Then Jung explodes and sends a letter back, and he says, as soon as you can stop attributing a psychosis to everyone who disagrees with you, then we can have a decent conversation. Until then, and then he's also putting in other sentences like, remember you said you could not risk your authority? And he underlines it. And I don't remember what the sentence was, but it's a very passionate, heated letter. And Freud doesn't quite know how to respond, and in fact he actually wrote back a very polite reply that he never sent, but the letter's in the volume, says this letter was not sent. And you read finding in the biography that Freud was afraid Jung would think he was a coward if he had responded so politely, so he waited, then responded, and he said, well, I think this can be worked out. I still believe in you. I still think that you're going to carry along the movement, and we just have to get our problems worked out. They go back and forth for a few more exchanges, and finally, Freud says, I believe that we should just break off relations with each other. And Jung says, I'm game for that, and that pretty much ends the relationship. There is one more Congress, because Jung is president of the whole movement at the time. They have one more Congress where they actually end up re-electing him president, even though all of Freud's followers now turn against him. But for political reasons, they have to re-elect him president. And it was said that Jung's few followers remained on one side of the room, and Freud was on the other side of the room. And it was at that Congress in 1913 that Freud reads his first short little theory of psychological types, which is, we'll see next time, turns out to be his response to situating Freud on one side and himself on the other. Freud is the extrovert, himself as the introvert. And so that pretty much wraps it up. But I just want to dwell on the primary symbol, the primary cult that Jung is fascinated with in the transformation